Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you all today. I'm so happy that you have come tonight to share the workshop with us. My name is Sandra Grauschoff. I'm the marketing manager here at Kodeco. If you're not familiar with Kodeco, we're an e-learning platform for mobile developers and for mobile dev teams. We're looking forward to giving you an introduction to iOS development today. I'm joined by senior developer David Okun, who I think is amazing, even though he doesn't like me to say it. He has been a bootcamp mentor for us in the past. He's also done a number of articles and videos and other content for us. And he's a really great teacher. I love hearing him speak on these topics. He's going to walk you through the first steps of building a working iOS app. So if you have Xcode installed, you can code along with David today. Just start by opening a new project and selecting an iPhone app project. If you aren't ready to code along quite yet, no problem. We'll send you a recording after the presentation and you can try it out on your own time. If you have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, and anything that I can answer in text, I'll be happy to do so. Other than that, we have a Q&A session planned for the end of the presentation. But please keep your questions to general coding topics. We're not going to be troubleshooting your app that you code along with us today. If it doesn't work as you expect, when you get the video, go back step by step and see if you missed something along the way. And if that doesn't work either, please feel free to come into our Kodeco Discord group. There are a lot of people there. It's a wonderful community who can support you and help you figure out what's going wrong and what your next steps are. So now I'll turn the workshop over to David to begin.
Thank you, Sandra. You're too kind. Let's go ahead and get started. We only have about a short hour of time, and the workshop won't close after that. There will be time for questions and answers, but I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. I'm going to start sharing my screen and putting up a presentation. Sandra, I'll count on you to tell me if the presentation is not showing, but I'm going to assume that we're off and live, so we'll go ahead and get started. So today, we're going to be building something real, and I think there's no substitute for the real thing. I think there's video learners, there's audio learners, and then there's what's called kinesthetic learners. I find myself to be a kinesthetic learner. I learn by doing, and that's why a workshop like this really appeals to me, because I think you get your hands dirty and you start to understand what goes into making these applications. This is what we're going to build. So you can see an animated GIF on the right of what we're going to build. And we're going to build the simplest possible to-do app, all on the iPhone. And it's going to be able to do these things. You'll be able to add items to the to-do list. You'll be able to remove items from the to-do list. You'll be able to sort items up and down your to-do list as you have changing priorities throughout your days. You'll also be able to switch to dark mode automatically. I love how that lined up with my speech. That wasn't planned, but I'll take the win. And you'll also be able to change the font size at any time. And this is all with, guess how many lines of code? I think if you saw the introduction, you saw it, but we're going to be able to do all of those things with less than 50 lines of code. Going into a workshop like this, and you might be considering, how is David going to walk me through doing all of those things in only an hour with only 50 lines of code? It's important to remember these three things throughout this presentation. First off, we are aiming this workshop at complete beginners. There might be some of you who are experienced developing for either iOS or other platforms, and so you might hear some information that's not news to you. I'm going to start with things like what is a string, what is an integer, what is an array, and if that's not new to you, I ask you just to remember that this workshop is aimed at total beginners so that we can level the playing field all across the board. The second rule is this is being recorded. I won't ask you to do anything that I won't do myself on the screen. So if any of us run into mistakes caused by me, I'll run into them too, and we'll be able to fix them live. But the most important thing is that this is being recorded. It is very common during live coding workshops. Something goes wrong. We typed something wrong. We have a spelling error. It's totally okay. If this happens, do your best to fix it. If you can't, that's totally okay too. You'll be able to go back through to the recording and watch it and pause it as I go. I do think that there's no substitute for doing something live though, and we'll be able to get that feedback in real time. Third, there's going to be a lot of things in this workshop that you're going to say, There's no way we can discuss this in an hour. For example, a conversation on state management and bindings in SwiftUI. There's no way we can cover that and everything else we're going to do in an hour. I've prepared a set of QR codes and links that you'll be able to screenshot shortly that lead you to more reading material and more video material that go into deeper dives on some of the concepts we'll cover today. But even then, you might be thinking, well, I'm still a total beginner. You're going to be saying a lot of words that I don't recognize. You're going to be talking a lot about things that I'm not really sure I understand. My dad told me if you ever want to be really good at making a French omelet, you have to crack some eggs. And so I liken this workshop to doing something like that. It's comfortable to be uncomfortable in this situation and to just code along with it and understand that sometimes you'll get the information as you go. So I just ask that you keep these three things in mind. And I'll pause for a quick moment for people to take screenshots. This is going to be all of the links that I'll be referring to. I'll pause at different parts during the live coding and I'll be able to say, to learn more about this, read link 1. To learn more about this, read link 2. All of these are QR codes that you can scan with your phone. We'll also be able to send out the actual links, the URLs, in the chat later on. I'll pause for just 5 more seconds. Please get your screenshots of this before we get going. That was 5 seconds. With that being said, I think we ought to dive right into it. Now, the prerequisite for being able to work with this workshop is you want to go to Xcode and you want to click File, New Project. And once you select a new project, you'll select iOS app, and you'll go through and you'll name your app whatever you want. Now, I've already done this, but remember, it's iOS app, and you'll click Next after that. Once you do that, I named my app to-do list testing just for the sake of having a name for it. And what this will do is this will give you what's called your IDE. IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment. And in this case, our IDE is Xcode. There's 2 files that we want to concern ourselves with over here. And if you look over here, I've got to-do list testing app, which if you see this, the name of your app is going to be the name of your app followed by app. And then you'll see this code right here. Now, in this app file, you'll see one key piece of information up here. That's @main. This signifies the entry point for your application. So that means when you open your device and you tap on the app icon, this is the first line of code that gets run to say, we're going to start by doing this. Now, the good thing is we're not going to be working in this file at all. In fact, we're only going to be working in one file and one object, actually, throughout the entire presentation. And you can see here inside this to-do list testing app, I've got an app which has a body and a window group. But the key thing we're going to be working with today is this little object called content view. If you go over on your left-hand side and you see the list of content view in your set of files, you can go over here and then you can be greeted by this screen. If you do not see the simulator over here on your right, this is actually called the canvas. It's not quite the iOS simulator. And what you'll see is if you don't see that by default, you can go to Adjust Editor Options. That's this pane right here. And you have an option to select Canvas, Assistant, and Layout. I recommend you select Canvas. So if I deselect it, this is what you might be seeing. If you select Canvas, this is what you should see. You also want to make sure that when you're selecting the simulator you use, I personally like to use iPhone 15 Pro just to have some consistency. That's not meant to be a humble brag that I have an iPhone 15 Pro, but it's just the latest and greatest that people are going to see as they're developing. And as you can see here, you've got a blank screen, you've got space for the dynamic island here, and we are ready to go with everything we need. So now let's take one more second and look at what we actually have here. Let's examine just these 5 lines of code right here for a brief moment. We don't even have to really pay attention to SwiftUI. All we have to do is talk about this, which is called content view. There's 3 words on this line that are important. First, we have what's called a struct. This is the basic definition of an object that you're going to work with in programming. They can be structs or classes. There's a deeper conversation on what those are, but we're going to be working with a struct in this particular tutorial. And this is basically the name of the struct that we're building. In this case, it's called content view. And the pattern that we see here is that to the right of any object that has a name, we have a colon, and then we have another type to the right of it. This type is called view. Now, you don't have to do what I'm about to do right here, but if you command click on it, you can see the way view is defined in the library that Apple provides. So that means this is something we get for free from Xcode just by virtue of using this IDE. Now, what that means is we've got an object named content view that is a type of view. Again, a lot larger conversation about what this could be. This could be a protocol. You could follow an inheritance pattern, but ultimately this is a type of view, and that's what is signified after the colon. Now, beneath here, we have this thing called var body, which we can follow the same pattern and say that this is some view. We won't worry about the some keyword here. Just know that this contains a view. And then we have these curly brackets here that contain something called text with a string of hello world right in the text. Now, if you look to your right and you see your canvas here, you may be able to infer that this is effectively a representation of what we have on the screen with our text with the string hello world. Sure enough, we can see that that's displayed right here on the center of the screen. Now, this text tool that we have, we'll call this a tool for today, is something that's provided to us by SwiftUI. If you've heard about SwiftUI versus UIKit, which framework am I supposed to use? That's another much larger conversation. Some people might consider it a holy war. We're going to be using exclusively SwiftUI for this presentation today, just to keep things simple. And what you can see is that inside my text, I've got a string in where I've already written hello world, and that's with double quotation marks on either side. So what's one of the first things that we can do to actually modify what we get on the screen on the right? Well, one of the first things we can do is we can consider that this string is a constant written inside this text. So if I were to change that, and instead this says workshop, you can see that over here on the right, it updates that automatically for me. Now, this is one of the cool features of Xcode lately, is that you have this live canvas that works with SwiftUI, so that just about in real time, as you make changes to your code on the left, you'll see those changes reflected to you on the right. Now, we can look here and we can say, this is great, but I want to be able to start making some changes. And I know that this is far too simple of a layout to be able to build the kind of user interface we want for our to-do list app. So we need to start thinking, well, where else can I mark this kind of constant value? Well, what you can do is you can go to the end of line 3 here, right after your view, and you're going to hit enter a couple of times. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to enter something called a constant declaration. Now, I'll pause here to explain what this is. But what you'll see is that I've written something called let text value, which is a type of string that equals, in quotes, hello workshop. What I've done is I've basically defined a variable inside the scope of my content view. And that means this variable, which is defined here, I can use that and plug that in right into my text tool. So if I delete these quotes and I hit TE, XT, autocomplete will come up and it will say, hey, we think maybe you mean one of these things, but based on the fact that I have this defined up here, you can see that it's shortened it to P text value. In this case, P stands for property. And if I hit enter in text value, you'll see that my screen refreshes and now I'm using a constant right there as a variable inside my user interface. What that means is now instead of having to change it in here, if I go up here and change the value of my variable, that change will get reflected over here on the right as soon as I make that change. So if you've been able to follow along so far, congratulations, you've done your first live coding, you've made a variable, you've plugged it into an actual user interface, and you've made that variable change, and you've updated your user interface. If you want to learn more about this, link number 1 that I sent you in the QR codes, that's going to be where you go to learn a little bit more about objects and how that works. Now, let's take a shift and focus on SwiftUI and the way this UI is laid out here. One of the interesting things about SwiftUI, which is a fairly new framework from Apple, it's been out for about 5 years now, is it's something called a declarative layout. Now, what do we mean by declarative? Declarative is when you tell or you declare to the IDE, I want my layout to look like this. I declare that these are the things that need to be on the screen, and you lean on the IDE to say, okay, I will figure that out for you. If you've heard of the alternative, the more common term is something called imperative user interface programming, where you actually write commands that say, build this rectangle, make sure its frame is this wide and this high. And we take a different approach with SwiftUI. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, what we can do is if I go ahead and change this text value inside this body, I'll delete this here and I'll add this instead. What you can see is that now I'm defining what's called an H stack. H in this case just stands for horizontal stack. And you can see that inside that H stack, I've written 3 text variables that all reference that text value variable that I've already written. Sure enough, just by the virtue of the name of this particular tool, this is going to put 3 of those text strings with that property right there for me inside my H stack. So what that means is if I change this in one place again, over here on the right, it will change that to Hello Workshop in each of the places because that variable is what's plugged in for me. Now, this means that I have declared I want a stack horizontally of 3 text strings. That's not really practical for a to-do list though. So what we want to do is make that look like something a bit more vertical. In order to do that, all we have to do is change this capital H to a capital V. And as soon as we change that to a capital V, we've declared that instead of a horizontal stack, we want this to be a vertical stack. And Xcode is going to lay out everything for us over here on the right. So now we've got a stack of 3 of these different text values here. And what's really cool about these stacks is that there's a lot of things you can add to them. What you do is you put your cursor after the K, but before this curly bracket. And if you type open parentheses spacing :20, what you're doing is you're then saying, hey, I also want to specify that there should be 20 pixels of space between each item inside of this stack. Now, sure enough, if I change this to be 200, that might not look a whole lot practical, but I do have 200 pixels of spacing. I can crank that up to 300 if I want, 400, but then you start to see this layout doesn't really make sense because we do have other forms of this string here, but it's hidden behind the dynamic island. So we want to make this something more practical. What we want to do is we want to change that spacing to 30 right here. Now, we can add a couple of other things here, but this is just an example of you are declaring a stack with a certain property and contents that are placed inside that stack. Now, let's talk about what we're here to build. Again, we're building a to-do list. And you might think, don't type this, but if I want to have multiple items in my to-do list, how would I go about representing that in code? One way you might think is, well, if I'm going to have 2 items in my to-do list, I need to have text value 2. And then if I have 3 items, I need to have let text value 3. We're not going to do that because not only is that not practical, but we actually have tools in the Swift programming language that make this a lot easier for us to store a collection of these strings instead of just one string on its own. We're going to be using something called an array for this. And by the way, I forgot to mention, when we talk about Swift UI views, if you want to learn more about declarative layouts, that's going to be link number 2 in the QR codes that we sent you. Now, back to arrays. What we're going to do is instead of having just one string that defines what is listed here, we instead want to change this to an array. So I'm going to copy and paste what I've got here, and I'll give everybody a second to go ahead and catch up. But we're going to go ahead and build this array. And as you're typing this out, I'll walk you through each part of this. And by the way, you don't have to read and write these exact 5 things. These are the things that are top of mind for me. You can see that I'm making formula for the baby. That's a very important thing I'm taking care of lately. But let's look at what we've got here. So we're saying let to-dos, and let, again, that just means that it's a constant. It can't change. But we're naming our array to-dos, and it's a type of an array of strings. We use the string, but we have these brackets on either side of it to indicate this is what's called an array of strings. Now, an array, think of it like a list. And a list has order. You can tell which one is the first item. You can tell which one is the last item. You can tell which one is the item at index number 3. Those are all some of the key characteristics of arrays. And what you can see is that we declare an array by saying array of string equals sign, open bracket, And then we put in all of these strings with commas at the end of them to indicate that these are the 5 strings we want to have in our array, or at least that's what we want to start with. These commas are very important. I know we see these errors over here, and we're going to fix those in just a second. But if we go and delete one of these commas, for example, my IDE is actually going to complain for me right away. So we need to make sure that all of your strings have commas at the end of them. By the way, if you want to learn more about arrays, because we're going to gloss over a few things with that, you want to go to link number 3 in the QR codes that we gave you a screenshot of. Now, where can we actually use this? Because we can already see that now that I don't have something called text value anymore, I don't actually have an opportunity to use this. So how would I use this? Well, you think, well, I only have one definition of to-dos, so I only really need one text, right? And if I can do that, I can just plug in to-dos right here. If I do that, this might seem logical, but this doesn't make sense. And that's because we get an error that says no exact matches in call to initializer. And if you do look at the error logs here, you can see that it's saying things like candidate expects value of type image or string key or close range. And it's basically what it's saying is this text, if I open this up, it says we can take a date interval, we can take something that's equatable, a subject, a date, etc., but we cannot take an array. And so in order to build something that is going to display all of the text in our to-do list, we have to use something called a loop. Now, a loop is a very important concept in programming. And what that means is you're going to say for every item or for each item in this array, we can do X number of things we want to do with our user interface. So let's go ahead and build that next. Hit enter after this VStack line. And what you're going to do is you're going to type for each, just like that. You're going to hit open parentheses, and then you're going to type to-dos. You'll be able to see autocomplete come up. And so if you see this to-dos right here, you can hit enter and it'll fill it out for you. One thing you have to do that I'm not going to clearly explain, but just trust that we have to do this, is you hit comma, space, ID, colon, space, backslash, dot, self. Again, that is a little bit more of an advanced concept as far as to-do lists are concerned. I'm going to let that gloss over, but there is education in some of the QR codes that I sent you if you want to learn more about how that works. Close that parenthesis and then use curly brackets to open that up just like that. After the curly bracket, you want to type to-do item in, just like that. And what this is going to give you is it's going to give you the ability to iterate or loop through every string in this array. And this to-do item is basically as you go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you have access to that particular string at that index, and it's called to-do item. So now that we know that this is a string, what we can do is we can type text to-do item. And if we build that here, our user interface updates right away. So now you can see over here that instead of having a VStack and we've listed every single string that's in the array and we've done it, deliberately. No, now we can add things to this array as we want to. So if I want to instead say go lift weights or something like that, which I probably need to do, haven't done that in a minute. But now you can see as I add things to my array, that's going to be flexible for me. Do a yoga lesson. And again, we don't need to write these things, but you can see how adding things to the array will populate it in this declarative layout. So that's just another example of how those variables work for you. Now, go back to where you only have 5 items in your to-do list and make sure that your user interface is updated. Now, what we want to do is to consider the fact that we're getting a little bit closer to what we want to build. We've got what appears to be a list of items on our device, but we're missing a key part of this. How do we actually add items to this? Because what we can't do is say, hey, I need to add something to my to-do list. iOS developer who's hiding behind the curtain, go ahead and add something to the array. That's obviously not practical. So user needs a way to tell the application, add something to the array. For this, we can use a button, a trusty old button, one of the oldest user interface components, tale as old as time. And what we can do is we can add that right here in our declarative layout. Now we'll do this as an example. We'll end up changing this in the future, but you can see the simplest possible example of how a button is going to work. Here's what we're going to type. I'm going to type it all out at first, and then I'm going to pause and explain it as we go through it. Button, print adding item, label, text, add item. And if you see here, we've now built a button. Now, it's very important that the button is beneath the for each loop, but it is still its own idea, its own property inside the layout that we're building. Now, you can see here also that we have two slots defined in our button. The first slot, or the first property that we pass in, is the action that we are going to complete when we tap on this button. Now, if you've done this right, you'll also see right over here on our canvas, that button has shown up on the screen, and you can even click on it to simulate a tap, and you'll see that it kind of has that tapped state where it just kind of changes the color of it to indicate that, yes, you've tapped this button. This first slot is the code that we are going to run when you tap the button. And this slot is for the label, which is a text that says add item. So if I change this to be add items plural, then you can see that it's going to change that over there. We only want this to be add item for now. So this is great, but how do we make this button actually do something? Because consider what we've done so far. We've got an array of items, and we've built a button, and we know exactly where the action's going to go. How do we build code that is going to automatically add something to this array or this list of strings that will then update on the user interface? This is where we get into another key part of software engineering, where we're going to use something called a function. We could also refer to this as a method. There are differences between a function and a method. That is not for this workshop, but we're going to build a function next to show you how you can use that to manipulate the state of your application. Go to the end of your array and hit enter a couple of times so you have a little bit of space between the end of your to-do list and the beginning of your body variable. And what you're going to want to type is this definition right here. And you're going to type it just like this, and I'll explain it as I go. What you've got right here is a definition for FUNC, func, which is short for function, as I'm sure you could understand. And here we've got something called add new item. This is the name of the function that we have declared. This is where you would add other things to your function, but for this, we're only going to type an open and close parentheses to indicate that it is a function and not a property that we are using. Then you have your two brackets that open and close it, and inside those brackets is where you add code that's going to ultimately run whenever you call this function. So what that means is we've got duplicated code here, we've got a print symbol for added item here, but we've also got it down here. What are we going to do to be able to call that function down here? Well, in this slot for the action of our button, we can delete that print statement. And if I type add new, you can see that autocomplete is going to give me exactly what I need. It recognizes that my function is defined correctly. And if I hit enter, the app will recompile for me and I'm in a good state. Now, if I click this button over here, nothing's really happening. You might have your console open at some point if you actually run the application, and you might see how that's being run, but we're not going to really concern ourselves with that because we want to actually add something to this array. And by the way, if you want to learn more about functions past the scope of what we're doing in this workshop, this is where you're going to go to link number 4 in the workshop's QR code that I sent to everybody. So now that we have this code, we've got it to the point where if I click this button, the code being run is add new items, but right now all it's doing is printing added item to my console. How do I actually add something to this array? We do that with a function that is on an array called append. So we're going to type to-dos, and you can see that I can use autocomplete to hit to-dos and hit enter. And if I hit .ap, you can see that I now have access to functions that I can call on that object. I'm going to hit append next to new element. And here I'm going to add a string that just says new item. Now, you're going to deliberately see an error here, and that is part of the plan. I tricked you. I got you into this state, but it's important to understand how we're going to get out of this. This right here is the correct code that is written. But let's look at this error right here. We're seeing that we cannot use a mutating member on an immutable value. To-dos is a let constant. We saw earlier that we named it a let constant because we didn't ever want this to change. But if we're trying to introduce code that is going to change the contents of this array, we obviously have to make this variable. We can't make this constant. Rather than change it ourselves, this is one situation where the IDE will actually give us a suggestion and it will say, change let to var to make it mutable. If I click fix, it takes care of it for me, just like magic. Now you might be thinking, hey, that was really cool, but another error popped up right away. Now, this is another important part of when you're learning to program and you're learning how to work with a new system. Oftentimes, it's very easy to get led astray by what the compiler is trying to tell you, because it's giving you its best guess at what it needs to do to fix it based on how many times the program has seen this information. And right here is an example of an incorrect solution to what we're trying to do. Now, it sounds correct because we're trying to say, oh, we can't use a mutating member on a mutable value. Self is immutable. We want to make sure that we mutate the state of self. So we mark this mutating. And you might think, okay, well, if I just take this suggestion again, that's great. I fixed that. That's what we do. But now we've got an error somewhere else. We're going to revert the change we just made because that's not actually what we want to do. Because now we're getting into a state where we're getting into an error that can't be automatically fixed. And this is a situation where we don't want to just let autopilot make decisions for us. So you're going to delete the mutating keyword before the keyword func. You're going to leave this here. And we're going to add something that is going to appear to magically make this work, but we're going to explain how this works. Go up to right before the definition of var to-dos, and before the var, type @state with a capital S before it. Now, what you're going to see is that the errors are going to go away. Your app is going to recompile. And if you click add item, you'll see that even if I click it a bunch of times, now I'm adding text of new item right there underneath the rest of my strings. You might see a couple of problems with this. Again, we're still not building quite a practical user interface, but we're getting closer. You're seeing that you're clicking buttons, you're making changes to your code, and you're actually getting things done. But you might be thinking, what the hell did I just type in front of my variable, and what does it mean? @state is one of the more involved conversations in SwiftUI. It has to do with managing the state of a variable. And the one-liner I'll give you that explains what it is, as well as a QR code that goes into a deeper conversation of it, is if you're ever going to update your user interface, and that user interface is based on a variable, it's probably likely that you need to mark it with @state. This is what's called a property wrapper. If you want to learn more about state, this is something that takes a while to understand in SwiftUI. QR code number 5 is going to be what you want to go to understand a more informed conversation about @state. For the rest of this, I'm going to ask that you just go along with it. If that didn't make sense, that's totally okay. Just know that once again, putting @state in front of this makes this work the way that we want to. But now we're in a state where we actually have two problems. Number one is we can only add one kind of string to the array. We've got new item, and it's very unlikely that people who use this to-do list app are going to only be working with something called new item. That's number one. But number two, before we go too far down that rabbit hole, we're also in a situation where this doesn't look quite right. It certainly looks better than the horizontal stack that we've been working with, but it's still not quite right. And if you saw that GIF I had earlier, we had something that looked a lot snazzier. How can we make this look a lot better? Well, we're going to make a couple of changes. So let's fix up this UI first. Don't panic. I want you to go ahead and everything with that button definition, I want you to delete it. Don't worry, we're going to write another one in just a little bit. But I want you to get this back down to where this is only a for each. Now, I want you to do one more thing. I want you to also delete the line that has vstack with spacing 30, and then the line before that. You'll want to go ahead and move this over, and I'll give you a second to do this. But what you'll see is you'll get to a stage where you only have this for each loop, looping over your to-dos with id \self to do item and text. Now, you might think this looks a lot simpler, but we haven't really done anything. We're still in the same situation that we've already been in. What are we going to do to change this? Well, this is going to be our first example of using what the system gives you. Like them or not, Apple have spent a lot of time and a lot of resources and a lot of money on making tools that give people default behaviors that they expect in the operating system. And one of those tools that exists in SwiftUI is something called a list. So if I select this for each, and if I just change for each to list and leave it alone, all of a sudden my entire user interface transforms over here on the right. Just by changing that to list, I now have a rounded rectangle with dividing lines between each of my items. I have a different background to give me a little bit of contrast that makes this list look a little bit better over here. And I've got, better typography, and I've got everything aligned over to the left to be able to make this look like an actual list. This looks a lot better. And we can even make this better continuing to use built-in tools that we have in the system for us. Go after the definition of body, and you're going to type now navigation stack, open parentheses, or open bracket, and you'll type another closed bracket after this. So this is what you want to end up with. And I'll pause for a second as people type to catch up. But if you get to this point, you may not see a whole lot of differences with what we typed over here on the right. So you might be thinking, what gives? What change did we actually make? This is an example of a change that really helps us a little bit more under the hood in terms of preparing this list to be used for navigating to other screens. We're not going to really be doing that in a to-do list very much, but instead what we can do is we can take advantage of naming our to-do list by using navigation stack. And so now what I can do is at the end of my at the end of my bracket for list, right after this, I can type dot navigation title, and you'll see that here available for me. And if I type my to-do list right here, now we have something that looks a lot more professional on our application. So you can see here that by using navigation title, I get a really pretty looking title that's in a large title font over here right above my list. But not just that. If I scroll up, you can see that it automatically animates and fades to the top of a navigation bar for me. It goes ahead and it grows as I drag my finger down. You can see that slight animation there as it changes. With quite literally 5 lines of code, you have a performant and system obvious list that just works out of the box, and people are going to understand as soon as they encounter it in your application, which is super important when you're trying to convince people to use software that you build. You want to make sure that people understand and don't carry a whole lot of cognitive load trying to figure out what the hell is it that I'm looking at. So if you want to learn more about lists, which we're going to continue on throughout this tutorial, but QR code number 6 is going to be how you learn a little bit more about lists here. Now, let's go back to revisiting the button. We solved this. We made the UI look a little bit nicer and a little bit closer to what we're trying to build. But now we want to get to a stage where, okay, how do I go back to being able to add an item to this list? And how do I make it type whatever I want it to? Well, that's what we're going to do next. I'm going to type a good amount of code here, and then I'm going to pause to explain what exactly it is that I've written. So don't be concerned, I'll pause. But what you want to do is go after this navigation title, hit enter so that you've got space here, and you're going to start typing this. Now, I will take a second to explain what all of this is, but remember, you're going to start by typing dot toolbar, and you'll type open and close brackets that are going to contain your next bit of code. Inside this toolbar definition, you're going to build something called a toolbar item. And here you're going to have a placement variable that you can build with this. You're going to see this dot primary action. As you're typing dot primary action, if you want and you type dot, you can see all of the different options available to you. This is basically using the default navigation system or navigation stack, as we've talked about before, to determine where this item is going to be placed on a toolbar. Remember that we want to use primary action for this. So that's what we're going to have defined inside our toolbar. And then once we're inside our toolbar, guess what? Our trusty button that we've used before is going to be built right there for us. And we're going to build it the same exact way we did before. We're going to name it a button. And in our first slot, we're going to call that function that we already called add new item. In label, we're now, instead of using a text string, we're going to say image system name plus. Another conversation on how images work and how you can get that. But once you type this all out, and I'll select what you're supposed to type at this point just to see. But if you look over here on the right, now we've got a stage where tapping that plus button actually starts to give me some new items as part of my list. And by really mashing that button, you can see that now my SwiftUI list is keeping track of all of these. Already, we can see that this looks a lot better. And by virtue of putting this button in the primary action on iOS, it knew exactly where to put that button to make it serve its purpose. Now, We also can see that up here at the top, if I scroll up, we've got a navigation bar that's already set up for me. That's one of the benefits of using navigation stack and using the tools that the system gives you. But we're not quite there yet, because that's cool that we built a new item, but we've gone no farther than we did before. How do I actually build a user interface that lets me enter my own text and add it to the to-do list? That's what we're going to do next. First things first, we're going to type something that you're going to need in a little bit. Go beneath your state var for to-dos, and underneath here, you're going to type @state var showing alert, which is a type of bool, short for Boolean, and that's going to be equal to false. Now, just type that in and just trust what we're going to talk about here for now. But what we're doing is we're now building another variable that represents the state of our application, and it's titled showing alert. If you're playing the long game, what this means is we're going to make use of something called an alert in iOS to build a dialog for us to enter a string into a text field. And what we want is that the default state of this application is that we are not showing the alert, because what we don't want is for an alert to always be showing. We want people to be able to see their to-do list at times. One more thing is that you might think, well, do I really need to specify that this is false? I mean, a Boolean can only be false or true, right? Keep all your jokes about nil operators and things like that. But a Boolean can only be false or true. And so what that means is we can use something called type inference to actually delete this Boolean and let the compiler figure out that this is in fact a Boolean. Now, type inference is a deep topic in software engineering. It's one of the really cool parts of the Swift compiler, that it can infer what types you're working with. Use this sparingly, because by not typing it, you are having your computer do the extra legwork to figure out, well, let me look at this. What type could it be? I'm using a Boolean. Great, we can figure that out. This is an easy example, but it can get complex and it can lead to performance issues as you go down that rabbit hole. If you want to learn more about type inference, you're going to want to go to QR code number 7 to be able to read about that. Now, that we've got the alert for our Boolean, or the Boolean for our alert rather, we're now going to go ahead and build our alert. Go down and click the curly bracket right after navigation stack. This is really helpful when you're starting to work with a lot of code. You want to see, where does it start? Where does it end? You know exactly where to go. And what you want to do after double clicking this opening bracket, click after the end of that bracket. And now what you're going to do is you're going to type alert. And I'm actually going to just copy and paste it, and I'll walk through it piece by piece. There we go. Right there. Perfect. So let's walk through that one more time. Again, you want to make sure that the beginning of .alert goes right after the end of your closing curly bracket for navigation stack. You type .alert, open parentheses, and then you can say, what do you need to do? You can make this say anything you want, obviously. But then if we look at this, this is presented is another variable that we're going to take. And this takes something called a binding. Now, in this binding, we've got a bool inside these brackets here. And you might be thinking, what is a binding? Well, that's going to be QR code number 8, the final QR code on your worksheet that I gave you. Bindings are another part of state management in SwiftUI. In one sentence, using a binding, or in this case, $ showing alert, basically says, I am binding to the state of this variable. Again, bindings and @state are a long, involved conversation in SwiftUI that we do not have time for in this workshop. So if you go to QR code number 8 and the QR code about @state, you're going to learn a lot more about that as we go. Once you have is presented in $ showing alert, then you open your curly brackets, and we're going to build yet another button. And just like this, in the first slot for the action, we're going to call that add new item function again. And then in this time, the label for this is going to be text with just OK. Now, if we click this button, we still don't get exactly what it is that we want to get. And that's because the action slot for our button is still calling the function that we wanted. So now what we need to do, if we think, well, clicking this button is going to show my alert, what do I need to do to show my alert? In this case, if showing alert is false by default, changing this to showing alert equals true is going to flip that and make the alert appear. So if I click showing alert true right here, and I click the plus button, that's going to make an alert pop up right on my screen. Now this shows up as a modal dialog, and you can see that right now it's still not very helpful, but this is another important part of software development, is getting those dialogs to show up so that you can allow for user input as you're building your application. For now, just click OK, and you can see that even as I click OK, it's calling, new item and adding that to our array. And that's because when you click the OK button, it's calling add new item. So now we're going to go down the rabbit hole and we're going to fix that. But before we do that, we need a place to actually add whatever text it is that we're going to plug into that array. So let's go ahead and do that now. Underneath the alert, you're going to hit enter right here. And remember, you want to be right at the end of alert and right above your button. What you're going to do is you're going to type text F, and you're going to see that you have options for something called text field. You're going to select this first one that takes title key and text right here. And if you hit that, you're going to see that you have two things you need to plug into it. A localized string key, which in this case is just going to be a string like we've been using. So you can click add item here, and this is what's going to show up in the placeholder. But then it's asking you for text, and that's taking a binding that contains a string. Well, we've got a binding that we can use for our state showing alert, but we don't have one for our string yet. What do we need to do? We can do the same thing that we did up here by going underneath state var showing alert. And now we're going to type at state var new item equals empty string. Again, at state, a variable called new item, and it's equal to empty string. Sure enough, after I define that and I go back down to this text, if I hit $ new item, it's going to give me that binding, and that's going to work correctly. So you might think, well, how does this look when I try it? If I go over to my plus button and click it, hooray, we've got a text field there. And I can start typing things like, oh, let's go ahead and finish this workshop. That didn't quite work the way I wanted it to. There we go. Finish the workshop. But if I click OK, I'm still getting new items. So how do we actually plug in the text that we enter in the text field to be what we enter into our to-do list? What we have to do is we have to go to the function that we wrote for this new item. And since the text that we enter is defined by this variable of new item, which is a binding here, what that means is I can go, instead of typing to-dos, append new item, I can instead refer to that variable that I had before, new item. You might think, wait, don't you need a $sign there? You don't. That's going to be a more complicated discussion. I would ask you to just trust me on this one. Crack an egg to make that French omelet, like I told you earlier. And so after you click to-dos append new item, the only other thing you have to do after that is type new item equals empty string. And all this does is reset the value after we decide to add it to our to-dos array. At this point, what we can do is if you look over here and you click this plus button, you're going to get that alert dialog. You'll see add item here. If I type finish the workshop and hit OK, you can see that we've now added an item to our to-do list. Add another item. So this is great. We've now accomplished almost all of our goal that we've got. We've been able to make it so that you can add items to your to-do list. Now you might be thinking, hey, David, there's only 12 minutes left in this workshop and we still have to be able to sort them and we have to be able to delete them. How are we going to make it that you can do those two things? Well, what if I told you that we can do that with $2 signs and one new property inside our list? That's exactly what we're going to do. In order to get the default system behavior of sorting a list and being able to delete items from a list, all we have to do is go to that definition of list, which is right here. And before the first to-dos, you put a $sign there. At the beginning of to-do item right here, you put a $sign there. And you change those to both be bindings. And then after ID equals \self, you do comma, edit actions, colon, and you hit dot here. Now you'll see right here that we have access to all, delete, or move. Well, we probably want all because, again, we want to be able to both sort items on the list and we want to be able to delete them. So if I hit all, what you can see right here is that if I add an item here, I've now added the item, but I can also now swipe to delete it. And I can actually swipe to delete other things right there as well. And if I even run this one more time on my iPhone simulator, which I already have right here, you can see that if I type finish the workshop again here, I can now hold and drag that up anywhere on my list. So what that means is by adding this $ right here, by adding this $ here, and using edit actions, which I get for free by just what Apple gives me, I've now completely made a to-do list where I can scroll up and down, I can sort things to work however I want them to be, I can remove items if I want to, and I have that all working. And you might think, cool, that's 3 things, but there were 5 things we were going to do. Well, by virtue of just using what the system gave us, we get dark mode for free. We didn't do anything special. We didn't do anything to override system behavior. We didn't use any third-party libraries or SDKs or any of this other junk that other companies give. That's a joke, by the way. Other companies work really hard on their dependencies, so make sure you give them credit where it's due. But by virtue of just using what the system gives you, you get expected system behavior, and that includes dark mode here. So if I switch back and forth between dark mode, if you want to see that, you can go to your IDE and you click this button, and you can change this to dark appearance or light appearance. I know a keyboard shortcut for that, and that works. But the 5th thing is, well, what if people need to, change their font sizes? For instance, I just got my grandma with some of my family a new iPhone, and she's getting a little bit older. She needs to be able to crank up her font size. How do we make sure that the font just works? Well, by virtue of just using what the system gives us, again, and I'll just kind of change this over here so you can see it. Bear with me one second. Because I didn't do anything special and because I didn't mess with what I've got, I can now crank up the font size to be however big I want. And I can even hold down on the title and it will show me that for the sake of reading for accessibility. I get everything I need just by following the defaults that the system gives me. Now, we've now built this application, and if you've built this, congratulations. You've got a functional iOS application that has a to-do list where you can add items to it, you can remove items from it, and you can sort them. Now, if you follow Apple, Steve Jobs and Tim Cook sometimes does this, where they'll, at the end of a presentation, they'll say, oh, but there's one more thing. And we indeed do have one more thing. It's kind of I don't know if you would call it a meme or an inside joke in the Apple community, but there is one more thing to discuss. Now, we've talked about building this for iPhone. It's possible if you've looked at this or if you work in a company for tech, you've talked about cross-platform development at some point. And we've done just iOS, but what about Android? How would this work on Android? And what if Windows Phone still existed? How would this work? We can't answer for Android. I'm not going to surprise you and say we built this for Android or I've resurrected Windows Phone and made it work here. But what if I told you that all of this code, by the way, if we look here, we started on line 3 and we ended on line 43. So we actually did this in 40 lines of code. So not even 50, 40 lines of code. But what if I told you that this code actually, the way that you're seeing this right here, it also works on 5 other devices just by virtue of using that code. And so what I can show you is that if you do this right, you actually have this app that's going to work for iPad just the same here. And so you can see that what I code for an iPhone will also work for an iPad just the same way. But that's not all. We can also see that by using SwiftUI out of the box, we also get a Mac app that looks just like this. And you can notice that the user interface is a little bit different, but what the code does is it caters to the platform and it does what the platform expects it to do. So you can see here that delete button looks a little bit different, but my list looks good here. I can drag things up and down. I can add stuff here. I get a regular Mac looking dialog that shows up here. And that's great. But that's only 3 platforms. What are the other 3, right? Well, we even have a to-do list built for the Apple Watch now. And so what you can do is you can scroll through here and you can actually, if you've got your finger on this, you can tap this and move it up and down. If you do solve the gravity equation, you can drag this over and you can add this. And notice all these animations, all this system behavior, you get this for free. You don't have to build this in. And notice how it even puts the button in the primary place for you right there. We also built it for the Apple TV, just by virtue of having this built with SwiftUI code that we didn't make any changes to. And you can see here that if I go over to the plus button, I can type here and I can click that I want to add an item here, and I can work with that. But there is a sixth platform that Swift works for. And yes, we even have a functional to-do list that works in Apple Vision Pro, that works the same way that you would expect it to. Oh, let me move my simulator around. I don't know how I did that. I'm still a Vision Pro newbie. But if you go here, what you can see is that I can drag this around. I can make this work as big or as small as I want it to be. I can even add more items here. And I can add things. I can even sort them. So even though I'm just using the simulator here, I'm able to move things around just as I need them to. And I can even delete items. So by virtue of using code that just follows what the system gives you, we developed a to-do list application for actually 6 different devices, all by writing less than 50 lines of code. With that, I will pause for questions.
Thanks so much, David. That was amazing. So far in the Q&A, we only had one question that I thought you could weigh in on. And that was one person said they couldn't scroll in their canvas. Was that just an individual problem, or is there something that you have to set to make that work?
Let me see where the question is. I see that you can, I'm looking through the
It-
questions and answers here.
It's under answered because
Answered,
I
right.
said we would ask you.
Right. I see that you can scroll the screen. I can't scroll up and down. Was that the one?
Yep.
Right. So here, when you can scroll the screen, I think you might have been talking about when you have the list and you have all of those items showing up. You can only scroll on a list if you have enough items that scroll past the boundaries of the screen that you see right there. So that's going to be something that's automatically built in for you, to where if you don't have something to scroll, it won't scroll for you. Now, there are tools that you can use, like a scroll view, that's going to build that in automatically. You can decide how that works for you, but that's one of those things that you can use, and that's one of the behaviors of a list. I hope that answers your question.
We have another question now in the chat. Is there a way to ensure the alert shows up blank after adding an item?
Is there a way to ensure the alert shows up blank after adding an item? Maybe I missed that piece. I think what you would want to do in that situation is you can add logic where you can build in conditional logic to what you type in there. So for example, what you could do is you could say, well, the text field is going to take in that text, and you could say something like if new item dot length, or yeah, just if we say if new item is empty, then we could run other code here that says do something different in this case, or we could use an else statement and do something different there. That's another part that we didn't really touch on in the workshop, but that's probably what you would want to start exploring. And in these functions is where you build logic that determines, okay, based on the state of this variable and this variable, what do I want to be showing next? That goes back to that declarative layout that we talk about with SwiftUI. And I would really recommend looking at the QR code labeled number 2 to be able to read through that, just so you can understand how you can modify declarative layouts like that. And I just realized I wasn't sharing my screen while I was pointing through things, so I apologize. Let me share that real quick just to show. What I meant is you can add logic here to your function that shows, oh, if this new item is an empty string, run this, else run that. I recommend you look at QR code number 2 for that. And I think I also saw somebody asking for what the QR codes were, so I'll go ahead and post those one more time. So I recommend, again, everybody take a good screenshot of these just to make sure that you can see what these QR codes, but we went through the recording. If you want to watch the recording once more, you can see when I call out specific numbers. Personally, I'm a fan. I've been working for Kodeco for a while, so I think these are all great. But If you want to tie those to specific parts of the presentation, we recommend you scan specific parts. And for what it's worth, if you want to go deeper, if your interest has been piqued and you want to try going into a boot camp and say, I want to build more than just a to-do list app. I want to build something that lets me play music. I want to build the next Apple Vision Pro application. You can go to bootcamp.kodeco.com. We're giving you a discount code for 60% off. Sandra, that's ridiculous. 60% off. And all you got to do is type learn iOS 0224. I thought it was 2024. It is actually 0224. That's because it's February, where it's a leap day today. But if you scan that QR code, you'll go right there. We do have some live and on-demand bootcamp available for anyone who's interested.
Thanks so much, David. We have a question here. Can you explain briefly what kind of stack you would use to build out the backend and endpoints of an app like this?
Let's see. God, there's so many choices with this. I would have, in a past life, I would have told you you can use Swift to build the back end, and you certainly can do that. You have lots of options available to you. Excuse me, you have lots of options available to you. We use Go at my current company. I've used .NET and Java and Node.js in other companies. So there's a number of different choices you have available to you. For something like this, I think Node.js is probably your simplest best bet. But if you're continuing to learn Swift, you can continue to learn how to build backends with Swift as well. I'd recommend checking some tutorials about Vapor on the Kodeco website to understand how you can build backends with that. If you want something easy that has a lot more support out in the world, Node.js is another thing that you can consider for that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. This I thought was interesting. Can we change the spacing of the cell on the list? Like he showed us how to do it originally, but not once we got the fancy format.
Right, right. The answer is yes. In order to do that, you would want to go to the item of the text in the cell, and that's where you can start adding view modifiers and spacing. That's not something we really talked about a whole lot in this particular demonstration, but if you go to, I think it was QR code number 2, you'll start to learn about view modifiers and how you can make changes to things like spacing, the fonts, different values in the text fields that you have. If you want to calculate values from numbers, you can do that with this view modifier. So I would recommend looking at that.
Thank you. I think I actually know the answer to this one, but we didn't talk about it in the workshop. Douglas asks, any idea why my list in Canvas works for swipe to delete, but I can't move an item up or down? When I try, it shifts the list and makes the space for the move, but then snaps back to the original list.
That is a bug on Canvas. So with Canvas, that's something that just hasn't been worked out a whole lot yet. But if you run your simulator, so Command R and Command B are the tools that you use on your IDE to get those to run. In your actual simulator, you'll see the better behavior. You can also see how this works on a device if you want to build this, but that's just a bug in Canvas right now.
If you notice, Douglas, that's why we switched over to the simulator so we could demonstrate it there. Okay, if we wanted to edit an item in our list, how much extra code would we need to achieve that?
I can't imagine it would be very much because let's think about this. You need a way, first you would want to think, well, what user action would I do to say I want to edit this particular item? You could say maybe tap it twice, or you press and hold and you select edit from a context menu. So we'd have to build the UI for that, but that's a user interface decision that you have to make first. What am I actually going to build to tell the user you can edit this item? Once you do that, you then have to say, okay, get me that value out of the array, put it in an input or that text field that we worked with. And then once I change that value, tapping a save button or a cancel button modifies the state of that data the way that I want it to. So I would say more than I want to, where this turns into a less than 50 lines of code workshop, but it would not take too much, and that's a pretty common thing to be able to do in to-do lists. I hope that gave you a good enough answer to your question.
Yeah. Someone asked, will a GitHub repo be available with the source code?
I can make one available. In fact, Sandra, if you're going to send out a recap after this with the recording, I can certainly put this source code in a GitHub repo. And if people want to try that out, they're more than welcome to.
Yeah, the email that's getting sent out is already written, so I don't think I can add it to that email, but I can post it in the Kodeco Discord channel. Our Discord is absolutely free. We have a great community there. Um, I'll post the link again in just a second in the webinar chat. So we can make one and post it there.
Sounds good.
I think Jasek is definitely thinking like a developer because he says extend this example with Swift data.
Right.
I don't I don't know what Swift data is, but I'm guessing we can't do that in 50 lines of code.
It's actually pretty easy to do. I did not prepare to do it during this presentation. Swift Data is a new tool introduced in iOS 17 that lets you save these items to a disk. So for example, if I were to quit this app, one of the things that I got caught on is that this doesn't save it between uses of the application. Swift Data does allow you to do that. And I would recommend, Kodeco has lots of great tutorials on Swift Data that would probably give you a good in-depth example of that. I would recommend starting from there so that you can see how you can save entities on a disk and things like that.
Okay, and then this might be too much of like individual troubleshooting, but I'm getting an empty row in between every time I add a new item list. All is working functionality wise. Do you have a quick insight there?
So without seeing your code, my best guess would be look at the function where you are adding to the array of to-dos and see if you might be calling append twice. The best thing you can do is start to learn about debugging, which again, there's more material on Kodeco.com to learn about how you can debug. But that's where I would start to look at that, but just see how many times do you say to-dos.append. You're probably calling it twice and you want to get it down to only that one time. Again, this is guessing based on not seeing your code. I hope that's helpful.
And I would again reiterate that our Discord has lots and lots of people who are willing to look at the code you've done and give you tips and advice. So if you don't see an answer with David's suggestion, then I would say go to Discord. This is an interesting point. You can put this page of code into ChatGPT and ask it how to add features, like how to edit an element. And that's a really great way to play around and see what kind of interesting things you can do.
I completely agree. I think that's a really great way to learn about this. ChatGPT does give some really good insights. I think we probably need another hour to have a discussion about ChatGPT and using generative AI and when you're using things like this. But I can certainly tell you that it can really give you some good tips and help you get some momentum as you're trying to figure out whatever problem you're trying to solve. So you definitely can do that. And I recommend giving it a shot to see what it does.
And then we have a question, do we need to have a real iPhone device to learn iOS development, or is a simulator enough?
That is a tough question to answer, even though it is actually easy. So all you need to build what we've built today is a simulator. You don't need an iPhone or an iPad to build that. However, the best way to learn about how to build for a given platform is to build for that real device. If you're in web development and you're learning how to build a website, that's a little bit easier because if you're writing code in an IDE, it's very likely you have access to a browser so that you can test out how that website's going to work. If you're building code for a server or a database, you're likely able to figure out, how to access those things. If you're going to build code for a mobile device like an Android device or an iPhone, it's usually a good idea to have one of those devices because nothing beats the real thing. Oftentimes in my career, I run into bugs that don't happen on the simulator, but it also happens, it doesn't, sorry, let me repeat that. I've run into bugs where the bug doesn't happen on a simulator, but it only happens on a real device. There's no substitute for the real thing. If you're going to get serious about doing mobile development, I strongly recommend you get a refurbished device so that you can start to learn to develop for that device. And I always recommend developing on the device to really make sure that you're getting things working the right way.
Fantastic. And I believe you covered this, it's probably in the video, but just a quick recap maybe. How do you launch the simulator?
The command key and the R key will run that. You also have a play button in the top left-hand corner of your IDE. Clicking that will run the simulator that you choose to the right of that.
Okay, so that's the last question I have in our Q&A. Does anyone else have any more before we wrap up? Okay, great. It looks like we're good to go. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We will get the GitHub repo set up and posted in the Discord chat, but probably tomorrow because it's pretty late my time here. And other than that, please look out for the email with the video. And if you have any questions, come on to Discord or reach out. I'm Sandra at Kodeco.com. Very happy if you email me and let me know anything, feedback about the workshop or any questions you have. So thank you so much, David, for doing this. I loved watching it. And thank you for all the attendees.
Thank you all very much. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.